Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where we examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how with education, rationality, and reason we can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. Recently, a friend of the channel made me aware of a survey for atheists that was published way back in December of 2011. And you know me, I love answering theist questions, so I couldn't resist checking it out. Even better, the survey was created by apologist Matt Slick and published on his Christian Apologetics and Research Ministry, or CARM, website, which is pretty much just where Matt collects his various apologetics arguments and various religious musings like John Doe from Seven.
And what I've done is going to be puzzled over and studied and followed forever. Yeah.
Now, while I myself have had a handful of interactions with Matt in the past, ones that never lasted very long because in the end he always ended up running away when his intellectual dishonesty was exposed, I haven't really ever covered him or his content on this channel. And that's because when it comes to apologetics, Matt Slick is more of a talking head than he is a creator of original content. So I've been content in leaving the covering of his various shenanigans to individuals like Tom Rabbit and Corsi the Fluffy Atheist, given that the content of both of these great creators is geared more towards critiquing open conversations over social media. But after reading it, Matt's survey really caught my attention because it's a great example of some of the tricks of the apologist trade in action. So let's dive in. Question 1. How would you define atheism? Kicking things off with a simple and straightforward question. In the most basic sense of the word, the position of not believing in the existence of a god or gods. Now, the specific reasoning behind that disbelief or lack of belief would go into my philosophy of truth and my epistemology, but those aren't really necessary just to answer this question. Question 2. Do you act according to what you believe in, there is no God, or what you don't believe in, lack belief in God? So as you probably noticed, this question is worded rather strangely, because by the lights of Matt's own worldview, there is only one God, the God of Christianity. So both options that he's offering here are essentially describing the same phenomenological or mental state. I do not possess the belief that the Christian God proposition is true. I do possess the belief that the Christian God proposition is false. These statements are essentially two halves of the same coin, but it's exactly this kind of wordplay that Matt Slick often engages in order to try and trip people up. This also means that the answer to this question is quite simple. Because the distinction he's trying to make here is essentially one without a difference, the answer would be both. Question 3. Do you think it is inconsistent for someone who lacks belief in God to work against God's existence by attempting to show that God doesn't exist? No, just because Matt doesn't like that some atheists, like myself, make the content that we do, does not make such actions logically inconsistent. What it is being intellectually honest and socially aware. When someone doesn't believe in the existence of a god or gods, they can approach the proposition in a number of ways. From a standpoint of intellectual honesty, they can explain the rational justification behind their own disbelief, or they can explain how the reasoning behind the claimant's position is irrational and therefore unjustified, or they could do neither because ultimately the argument really doesn't matter to them. But from a socially aware standpoint, they could address how irrational beliefs often lead to irrational behaviors, especially in defense of those beliefs. So if the individual's goal is to reduce societally harmful behaviors, then it stands to reason that they should be able to provide argumentation and evidence that refutes the beliefs that are used to justify such harmful behaviors. I'm also not a fan of how specifically Matt worded this question because he's essentially poisoning the well. His framing of what is essentially the employment of critical reasoning as working against God's existence is ridiculously loaded, and it really only serves to reinforce the cult notion that atheists, like myself, who do this kind of content, only do it for reasons that they desperately want to present as being nefarious in nature. Question 4. How sure are you that your atheism properly represents reality? This is yet another trickily worded question. Matt's implication here is essentially that atheism is making a positive claim about external reality, which it is not. Atheism is a position concerned with the personal belief of an individual regarding one single proposition, the existence of a god or gods. So, representing atheism accurately, given that in the sum total of reality that I perceive, I do not possess the belief that a god or gods exists, then identifying myself as an atheist is an accurate representation of reality. Question 5. How sure are you that your atheism is correct? Once again, he's trying to smuggle that positive claim about external reality in there. And again, that is not what atheism is. Now, how sure am I that I don't believe in the existence of a god or gods? Pretty damn sure. What you probably should be asking here, Matt, is how certain am I that the non-theistic worldview that I hold to is correct? You see, there are different implications there because now we're talking about the totality of a worldview instead of just one piece of it. And the answer to that question is also very certain. Question 6. How would you define what truth is? Understanding one's own theory of truth is a very important aspect of philosophy. The core of my personal philosophy of truth is correspondence theory, meaning that which is true is that which corresponds with reality. But that core is then pillared upon coherence theory, which is the theory that that which is true is also logically consistent with other true propositions, and pragmatic theory, which is the position that that which is true is determined by its practical consequences and how well it applies in the real world. The first one, correspondence theory, is pretty much what most people adhere to, even if they don't really know how to articulate that. The second part, coherence theory, checks to see if my correspondence conclusions are logically consistent, and the third, pragmatic, keeps my correspondence conclusions held to that which is applicable in demonstrable reality, such as verifiability, novel testable predictions, and the principles of parsimony. It's very much like how we develop the large-scale multidisciplinary predictive models that we utilize today. And another important point is that it's also how I know how deductive arguments alone are not evidence for the thing that's being argued for. Question 7. Why do you believe your atheism is a justifiable position to hold? The quick and fast answer is that I am not convinced that any god or gods exist, because thus far there has been insufficient evidence or argumentation presented to warrant belief in the existence of such entities. This of course can go a bit farther depending upon which god we happen to be talking about. If we happen to be talking about classical deism, then the sheer unfalsifiability of that claim is justification enough. If we're talking about the version of the Christian God that's defined as being all-loving, then the argument from divine hiddenness would be my justification. If we're talking about the omni version of the Christian God, then I know that doesn't exist because it's defined in a logically contradictory way, therefore my disbelief is again justified. Now in response to this, Matt would likely try to proffer up some version of the Christian God that escapes these logically entailed problems. And in the course of that discussion, we'd wind up going round and round until eventually he just concedes that his God is indistinguishable from classical deism. And then we'd be right back to the unfalsifiability that would then justify my disbelief. Question 8. Are you a materialist or a physicalist or what? Another oddly worded question, and it's either worded this way because Matt's deliberately trying to trip people up, or he lacks the philosophical acumen to actually ask this question correctly. Because the two terms, physicalism and materialism, are closely related, they are often used interchangeably with one another. But in fact, they are two separate philosophical positions. Materialism is the philosophical position that everything is composed of matter. But just by that wording alone, we can already see that that position is wildly outdated. Side note, materialism is also the opposite of idealism, which is the philosophical position that everything is fundamentally mental. Now, physicalism is more of a contemporary term. It builds upon the original concept of materialism with our better understanding of things like physics, by including things that are technically not matter, like energy and space-time. So, while all physicalists are materialists, not all materialists are physicalists. So to answer the question here, technically I'm both. But even then, that would be somewhat reductive in describing my worldview. Because going one step further, I hold to naturalism, but even more comprehensively, I hold to methodological naturalism, which, to bring this full circle, is a position I hold as a result of my philosophy of truth. If no one has ever said it to you, Matt, I will. Until you can demonstrate that your God exists independently of mind and context without begging the question, parsimony will forever be the hurdle that you will be unable to overcome. Question 9. Do you affirm or deny that atheism is a worldview? Why or why not? So I guess semantically you could say that I deny that atheism is a worldview, but that denial is not willful, it's resultant, because atheism definitionally is not a worldview. The word you're looking for, Matt, that I used earlier to describe a worldview is non-theistic. And yes, while the two terms can be used synonymously in a colloquial sense, in the field of philosophy they are distinctly different. Question 10. Not all atheists are antagonistic to Christianity, but for those of you who are, why the antagonism? Like Voltaire adroitly articulated, truly, whoever can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Irrational beliefs often lead to irrational behaviors, especially in the defense of those beliefs. The individuals you speak of are antagonistic towards Christianity likely because they have seen firsthand the direct and substantial harm that is caused to their society by irrational believers. And as such, they've seen fit to take it upon themselves to try and limit or even eliminate the source of that harm. Question 11. If you were at one time a believer in the Christian God, what caused you to deny his existence? There you are trying to misrepresent the atheist position again. To answer the question though, the starting point was the recognition of a disturbing lack of logical consistency. And a little more than a decade of rigorous study after that left me incapable of believing that such an entity exists unless one can be demonstrated to exist. And since it was you, Matt, who invoked the Christian God with this question, I can tell you that I do not deny that it exists. I know for a fact that it does not exist. This of course applies to the standard mainstream definition of the Christian God, so Matt will probably just go down the whole redefinition rabbit hole towards unfalsifiability in order to try and get around it. Question 12. Do you believe the world would be better off without religion? Religion, yes. Social support systems, no. Luckily, there is a solid distinction between the two concepts. Question 13. Do you believe the world would be better off without Christianity? Well, that's also kind of a tricky question. In a historical sense, the answer would be no, because the existence of Christianity, and by extension the violence that it utilized in order to spread and dominate the Western world, ensured that the Western world would not be dominated by what I would argue are, subjectively of course, faith systems that are far more savagely dogmatic. In a contemporary sense, however, yes, we would be better off. In this modern day and age, the survival utility afforded by ancient religious systems has become a distant memory, and now they really only serve to do more harm than good by generating unnecessary societal division. Question 14. Do you believe that faith in a god or gods is a mental disorder? A mental disorder? No. Just a willful lack of education. Question 15. Must God be known through the scientific method? If you want to claim that the God exists as a concrete thing and it interacts directly with the world, then yes, you would have to demonstrate that it does in fact exist in either a direct or indirect way. A model that utilizes the God information to make better and more accurate novel testable predictions than any of the ones that we currently use would be a great place to start. Question 16. If you answered yes to the previous question, then how do you avoid a category mistake by requiring material evidence for an immaterial God? And this question is an example of Slick trying to measure up to his own name and failing miserably. In fact, your own theistic worldview invalidates this question, Matt. If it were the case that the only defining attribute that you gave to your God was that it was immaterial, then yes, that would be a category error to demand material evidence of that which is definitionally immaterial. But you don't believe that. You may believe that this entity is immaterial, but you also believe, as entailed by your worldview, that it interacts directly with the material world. In keeping with the laws of logic, a God action cannot be indistinguishable from a non-God action. Thus, the evidence of its existence, albeit indirectly, would be the model that establishes through novel testable predictions the mechanism by which we could differentiate between God actions and not God actions. This question is yet another example of theists crawfishing into deism in order to try and escape the logical entailments of their theistic worldview. So in reality, it was in fact you committing the category error, Matt, not us. Question 17. Do we have any purpose as human beings? Subjectively, yes. Objectively, no. And yes, before you freak out, Matt, that is a knowledge statement. Because even if a God did exist, then any purpose that it dictated would still be subjective or mind-dependent. Question 18. If we do have a purpose, can you as an atheist please explain how that purpose is determined? Individual purpose is determined for oneself, generally as a result of the experiences that one has. Whether or not someone has the psychological or emotional capacity to do so, which hinges on a number of other factors, is entirely separate. Question 19. Where does morality come from? Our species' capacity to distinguish between what we subjectively determine to be right and wrong or good and bad is a direct result of our evolved capacity for empathy as a social species. Question 20. Are there moral absolutes? No, there are no moral absolutes. And again, yes, this is a knowledge claim because even if a God did exist, any moral distinctions that it makes would be subjective to it. Question 21. If there are moral absolutes, could you list a few of them? As much as you might want them to, they simply don't exist. Question 22. Do you believe there is such a thing as evil? If so, what is it? As a label subjectively applied by an individual or a society to describe those actions and outcomes that directly contradict subjectively determined standards of what is good, yes. Question 23. If you believe that the God of the Old Testament is morally bad, by what standard do you judge that he is bad? Basically, my extended take on the logical problem of evil. It is a fact that this particular God is defined as having nothing exist externally of itself that acts as a point of reference or a point of appeal. This entails that anything it does because it wants to do it and not because it must necessarily do it. Because the God itself definitionally sets the standard for what is and is not good and or evil, then those standards are essentially reduced to being whatever it wants, whenever it wants, for whatever reason it alone wants. If the circumstances that allow for the logical possibility of evil actions and outcomes exist within the system, when simultaneously nothing exists external of the God to dictate to it that these things must necessarily ever exist, as it is the one that definitionally sets the standard for what is evil, then the fact that things by its own lights it establishes as being evil exist means that they exist because it wants them to exist. And an entity that wants evil when it is definitionally unnecessary cannot be morally good. Question 24. What would it take for you to believe in God? To believe such an entity exists or likely exists? The model I presented earlier. Now, worshiping, following, or even respecting such an entity? That's a different question. Question 25. What would constitute sufficient evidence for God's existence? Again, the model I presented earlier. Question 26. Must this evidence be rationally based, archaeological, testable in a lab, etc., or what? It must be able to make novel testable predictions about reality, meaning predictions that yield new information. Question 27. Do you think that a society that is run by Christians or atheists would be safer? Why? For me, I don't think pigeonholing social authority is ever a good idea. The evidence shows that a society open to the free exchange of ideas operates more efficiently and productively. So I would say neither, and I would advocate for a secular society, one that does provide consideration for people's individual beliefs, but whose ultimate decisions in regards to the governance of that society are applied with equanimity and with evidence-based equal representation. Question 28. Do you believe in free will? Free will being the ability to make choices without coercion. Another sticky question. Personally, I tend to agree with compatibilism or soft determinism. But if you were to put a gun to my head, I would have to concede that the conclusion is currently indeterminate. We just don't have enough data to come to a concrete conclusion either way. Question 29. If you believe in free will, do you see any problem with defending the idea that the physical brain, which is limited and subject to the neurochemical laws of the brain, can still produce free will choices? And this is just a badly worded question. Remember, Matt, the determination of free will is predicated upon the individual's perception of the circumstances around them. If you perceive that you have free will, then you perceive you have free will. It doesn't mean that you actually have it, it just means you perceive that you do. In fact, if it were the case that we were living in a deterministic universe, it would actually be that your perception of free will is itself determined. This is why I hold that the position is indeterminate, and you trying to dive off into the physical operations of the brain is just unnecessarily muddying the waters. Question 30. If you affirm evolution and that the universe will continue to expand forever, then do you think it is probable that given enough time, brains would evolve to the point of exceeding mere physical limitations and become free of the physical and temporal, and thereby become deity and not be restricted by space and time? If not, why not? Firstly, evolution and an expanding universe are two entirely separate concepts. Second, it's always weird when you front-load a question like this. And thirdly, your hypothetical here is leaving out a lot of variables, the most important of which are selection pressures, which can stop a species' evolution in its tracks by rendering it extinct, or humans inadvertently destroying themselves by artificially selecting our species into such a state of specialization that our population becomes incapable of evolving to survive some other scenario. And lastly, no, as I am not a dualist, I do not hold that brains will ever not be subject to space and time. And I hold that position because the mountains of evidence indicate that mind-body dualism is nothing more than woo nonsense. Question 31. If you answered the previous question in the affirmative, then aren't you saying that it is probable that some sort of God exists? Now, to answer his question, I did not answer in the affirmative, so no, I do not hold to that. But putting that aside for a moment, Matt, there's an important thing that we have to nail down here. You are either talking about the God that you personally believe in or one that you do not. I'm only interested in the one that you actually believe in. not some esoteric definition of a deity that you're contextually applying to a hypothetical that you created just to try and win an argument. If you want to argue for deism, Matt, then argue for deism. Just be sure to acknowledge that the concept is nothing more than abstracta in your head that you hold to affirm your fifis. If you want to argue for theism, then break out what you think is your best evidence and I'll show you how it's not. But if your only interest is in manipulating others through wordplay to try and appear smarter than you actually are, which, from my direct interactions and reported interactions with you, seems to most certainly be the case, then I, like some others in your life, simply have no more time for you. Now, trying to bridge the divide here is a bit tricky. Not so much because how we can do it is so difficult, but because of how the other side oftentimes does all that they can to make such an endeavor virtually impossible. And while I will readily concede that not all apologists or even Christians engage in this type of behavior, Matt Slick and the people like him certainly do not fall into that category. The interest of these individuals has never really been in convincing others that what they believe is true, because it's always been in the servicing of their own egos by winning arguments against those less educated than they are. Always remember that the power these people have is not in the knowledge that they possess, but in the knowledge that they know that you don't. This is the very reason why the focus of my channel has always been to try and bridge the divide with the audiences of the individuals I cover and not with the individuals themselves. And in recognizing that, it's important to remember not just why the arguments that are presented by apologists consistently fail, but also the reason the individuals that are presenting them are presenting them. While some individuals desire an open exchange of ideas or seek other viewpoints with intellectual honesty, some individuals only seek to utilize intellectually dishonest tactics, such as loaded terminology, obfuscation, and semantics just so they can try and win an argument. In short, they're not doing it for the discourse. They do it to facilitate their own fragile egos. So while we can bridge the divide with much of the other side of the debate, it's important to remember that there is a distinction between those individuals looking to take the time to actually learn and those individuals seeking only to monopolize your time, thus limiting your opportunities to reach others. By constantly keeping this in mind, we will be able to maximize our time with legitimate, intellectually honest discourse and minimize the time we spend platforming malignant narcissists whose only interests lie in preserving the power and control that their identities so desperately depend on. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, July is National Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. A link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you like what you saw here and would like to support this channel further, a link to channel membership and to get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear is also in the description. Once again, thank you all so much for your continued support of the channel, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.